Greetings. Father Mark signing on from St. Louis, King of France Parish in Bucktown, Louisiana on the 20th day of June, 2020. This is part 2 of the presentation for the seminary summer program on historical examples of church ministry in times of crisis, specifically times of pestilence, relevant to our COVID situation. If you have not seen the first installment, it is on this channel under the Church History playlist. It is titled Yellow Fever 1793. That was the outbreak in Philadelphia. This presentation can be understood without seeing that one, if you wish. In the first one, you would find a more detailed explanation on the etiology of yellow fever. If you do not have the time to rewatch it, suffice to say that yellow fever is transmitted by the mosquito, one species of mosquito, Aedes aegypti. When the female of the species bites a food source, that's us, to extract blood, bacteria from her salivary glands enters our bloodstream, and that causes the yellow fever. She consumes blood to extract protein in order to grow her eggs, which she lays in pools of stagnant water, bringing into the world up to 200 new Aedes aegypti to make all of their inestimable contributions to the world. Essentially, it's the same vector as malaria, except malaria is a different species of mosquito. That's the Anopheles, but it's the same process. In the case of yellow fever, it has a 50% mortality rate. Even today, there is no cure. But today, we have a vaccine that did not exist in the period covered in this video. In this sequel, we will go back from 1793, the one we covered last time. We'll go back 75 years in time to 1718, and then go forward 135 years to 1853 for the worst yellow fever outbreak in American history, which took place right here in New Orleans. In 1718, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, better known by his seigneurial title of Bienville, established New Orleans at a point when the Mississippi River, it winds, and at a time when at a place where there was a point in the bend, so that was higher ground. He established it as a colony of France. He was Canadian. He was of French extraction, but born in Canada, which at the time was New France, was part of France. So he was serving France. His older brother Pierre, whose title was Iberville, had already died of yellow fever. 18 years after the foundation of the city, the first charity hospital was established, funded by a last testament bequest of a French immigrant, mariner, shipbuilder named Jean-Louis. When it opened on the 10th of May, 1736, it was named in honor of his patron saint. It was the Hospital of St. John. It was located on the corner of Charter Street and Bienville Street, which was within the French Quarter at the time, which was we'll get to that, the boundaries of the city. In only 7 years, the needs of the colony overwhelmed that original facility, so it was relocated in 1743 to Basin Street and renamed Charity Hospital for the Poor. 23 years later, in 1763, in the settlement of the 7 Years' War, that's the French and Indian War in American history. The settlement at the end of that war transferred ownership of the Louisiana colony from France to Spain. So New Orleans became a colony of Spain. 22 years after that, still during the Spanish period, which brings us to 1785, The charity hospital moved into a third facility, and it was renamed in honor of the patron saint of the reigning king of Spain. It was called St. Carlos Hospital in honor of King Carlos III. There it remained through the Napoleonic Wars, in the course of which Louisiana reverted back to France, and then France sold it to the United States in 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte of France sold it to Thomas Jefferson, who was the President of the United States. The first American governor of Louisiana was William Charles Cole Claiborne. Yes, Claiborne Avenue for you locals. Claiborne also contracted yellow fever, but he survived. His first wife and daughter, however, were not so fortunate. They contracted the disease at the same time he did, but they died. Subsequently, Claiborne remarried, and believe it or not, his second wife also contracted yellow fever and also died of yellow fever. Anyway, back 6 years after the Louisiana Purchase, which brings us to 1809, the St. Carlos Hospital burned down. The U.S. Census revealed that the population of New Orleans had tripled since the Louisiana Purchase. So the 1803, so in 6 years the population tripled. But for the next 6 years, the city had no dedicated hospital to the poor. There was a wandering clinic after the fire in 1809. It was a clinic improvised in the Cabildo, which is on Jackson Square. Those of from here, obviously, you know where that is. But visitors, whenever you see the images of New Orleans, chances are they'll show the cathedral. And if you're facing it, to the left is the Cabildo, to the right is the Presbytery in Jackson Square. It only stayed in the Cabildo for a month. Then it was the charity hospital. Well, not really hospital, but charity clinic, was moved into a building offered by the Jordan family in the Faubourg Marigny, and it was used for 6 months. The Marigny is down river. Well, it's outside of the French Quarter. Then, for the next 5 years, it was in a building loaned by the Laverne family, on the downriver, again outside of the French Quarter, on the downriver side of Esplanade. Meaning, during this period, Louisiana became the 18th U.S. state in 1812. The fourth official charity hospital opened 3 years later in 1815 on the upriver side. That's on the other of Canal Street, in the same square as the Roosevelt Hotel is now, for those of locals, which is across the street from Jesuit Church on Barone Street. But it was the whole square so where the Roosevelt Hotel is now. Anyway, the whole square, it's on that square anyway. I'll just leave it at that. I used to have a bunch of maps, nice historic maps, of the city, of the state, and other country, things from antiquity. They were all destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. And just like books that go out of print, it's so difficult to find those things. When you buy them, you think they're always going to be there. You can always replace them, but after Katrina, you can't. It just and maps. It's just like a technology it's gone out of existence. I mean, try to go to a gas station and get a map now, and let me know what happens, because I've tried. And anyway, it's a digression. It's those of you who are history fans know what it means to lose your maps. Okay. In the same year, 1815, a lot happened that year. That was the Battle of Waterloo. That was Napoleon's final defeat. So the final end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the period of the Restoration began. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in France, but it didn't affect, because New Orleans at that point was already part of the United States. But also in 1815, New Orleans received its second bishop, who was another immigrant. Our first bishop was born in Cuba, because we were part of the Spanish Empire at the time. So our second bishop, even though we're part of the United States, he also was an immigrant, Louis de Bourgh. He was born on Saint-Domingue, an island, which is now Haiti. And so he came in 1815. 2 years later, 1817, the city experienced another yellow fever outbreak. At this point, in 1817, statistics started to be kept of how many people died of the yellow fever. Between 1817 and 1905, 41,000 people died of yellow fever in New Orleans alone. Now, there are those who argue that number should be higher, that some people may have died, actually had the fever, but it was misdiagnosed as something else, or their bodies were just found and nobody knew what they died of. They were just, they smell something and go in a house and this guy's dead, and didn't know that he died of yellow fever. Anyway, but officially 41,000. And that is in a book from written by a guy named George Augustin, and it's titled History of the Yellow Fever. At the time, the city of New Orleans consisted of the present-day French Quarter, the Vieux Carré. That just means the old square. It was officially bound by so there's the river, the Mississippi River to the south, and the city's, is right on that. And then to the north, so there's the river to the south, then to the north, Rampart Street. And then on the two sides would be Esplanade and Canal. So it's now a historic district. And the Historic Landmark Commission stipulates that this area equals 85 blocks. Now, if you look at a map, it doesn't look like that should be right, but they're just looking at the area where blocks could fit. So if you visit the city now, because of the levee system and the moonwalk and parking lots and the piers for the port, that a lot of that area is not residential, it's commercial. Anyway, after the first outbreak of the fever, in his time there, Bishop de Bourgh decided to create a funeral chapel outside of the city, meaning outside of Rampart Street, because there was actually literally was a wall. That's why it was called Rampart Street. There was a wall, and then to put it outside of the city, in order that the faithful who died of the disease could receive a proper burial without angering the residents inside of the city. Now, why would they be angry? Well, it was widely believed at the time that this disease spread. It was the miasma theory. They believed that it was foul-smelling odors that caused diseases like malaria and yellow fever. I mean, the word malaria actually is from the Italian, bad air. That's what they believed. So anyway, that's why they would he was going to accommodate them by burying him outside of the city. A lot happened with Bishop de Bourgh. That's a whole nother thing. Anyway, it was finally completed after he left. There was a temporary administrator who was an Italian immigrant priest, Bishop Joseph Rosati. He ended up being the founding bishop of St. Louis, Missouri. But there was a time he was also administrator here. And it was during that period that the funeral chapel was finished. But it was not dedicated by Rosati because he was up in St. Louis. It was actually dedicated by the rector of St. Louis Cathedral, who was a Spanish immigrant priest. He was a Spanish Capuchin, Antonio de Sedea. He actually did the ceremony. In 1826, it opened as Our Lady of Guadalupe Mortuary Chapel. It was on the north side of Rampart Street, meaning on the outside of the city. Conveniently, right next to St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery, a Catholic cemetery, and it was very near, within walking distance of St. Louis No. 2 Cemetery. Now, this church is still there, the original church from 1826. And so you locals will know this better as the St. Jude Shrine. It's a giant statue of St. Jude. And when I was growing up, they used to have the St. Jude Novenas. Father Peter Rogers was a very well-known priest. He's deceased now, but when I was growing up, he was chaplain to the police and fire departments in New Orleans. He had his own car, his radio. It was Car 30, and he was a chaplain. And he was there. It was an oblate. The oblates had it. So anyway, that's a little part of history. The next bishop in New Orleans was a Belgian immigrant, the Most Reverend Leo de Neckery. He died of the yellow fever, died of mosquito. He died 7 years later on September 4th, 1833. Meanwhile, after 17 years of limited funding for the indigent sick and squalid conditions, leading locals to view a trip there as certain death, a fifth charity hospital was constructed, opening in 1832. Situated in the Faubourg Sainte-Marie, which was the American sector of the city, today that's the CBD, the Central Business District. So the French Quarter, we said, ended at Canal Street. It's called Canal Street because the plan was it would actually be a canal, but the canal was never dug, but the name stayed there. And then on the other side was the Gravier plantation, and so the Faubourg Sainte-Marie was carved out of, he carved it up and started selling it, and so it was the Americans started moving in, after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Then that's where they moved. Obviously, because the original city, the French Quarter, was already full of people. So then they started building new houses in the Faubourg Sainte-Marie. And anyway, that's where the charity hospital, the fifth charity hospital, was located. It was built on today's streets would be Girard, Gravier, Common, in that area. In 1834, the story of Charity Hospital and the yellow fever directly intersected once again with Catholic history, which is why I went through all the background of Charity Hospital, as it was in 1834 that Charity Hospital was entrusted to the care of a religious order of Catholic women, the Sisters of Charity. They partnered to improve the quality of the care. They partnered with the newly established Medical College of Louisiana, which is an institutional ancestor of Tulane University. Today, Tulane is a private university, but that happened later. Originally, the Medical College of Louisiana was public, and then later a benefactor, Paul Tulane, endowed it, and then Tulane. It's one of the few, where it went from being a public university to a private university, and still exists. Anyway, 2 years later, 1836, a new congregation of religious women came together in New Orleans, initially calling themselves the Sisters of the Presentation. They exist today as the Holy Family Sisters. Their leader was Henriette DeLille. So this would be, in English, would be Henrietta, but she was francophone, so it would be Henriette. And here, the story of the yellow fever, the mosquito, and Catholic history intersect with the peculiarities of New Orleans society. New Orleans, owing to its history as having been a colony of both France and Spain, as well as being a port on the Mississippi, and the Mississippi empties into the Gulf, and the Gulf is into the Atlantic, so it's a nexus of trade interior through the river as well as international trade from the ocean into the Gulf. So it's a nexus of the southern plantation economy. Because of all of that, New Orleans had a social structure quite distinct from other U.S. cities of the time, even other southern cities. So to put some numbers to this, out of a total population of 119,460, those of African descent included both free and slave. Free African Americans were described in the 1850 census as free people of color. Locals in New Orleans at the time would have described them as Creoles of color. That's spelled Creole. They were actually counted that way in the census of 1850. They numbered 9,961. While the slave population, those of African descent who were enslaved, they were also counted in the census, counted separately. They numbered 18,068. In colonial parlance, a Creole was a person born in the colony having French or Spanish blood. So a Creole of color was like Henriette DeLille. That's why I'm mentioning all this, because Henriette DeLille was considered a Creole of color. She was born in New Orleans. She had European blood, but she also had African blood. Whereas white Creoles were those born in New Orleans, born in the colony, born in New Orleans, that had only French or Spanish blood. So, for example, if someone, we had many Irish immigrants who came here, many Italians, many Germans, but they, even though they had European blood, even if that European blood was pure, say, two Irish immigrants came here, they had children, those children would not be considered Creoles. It was only those of French or Spanish descent that were. So now, these distinctions may appear arcane to the modern ear. And, well, they are arcane to the modern ear. But remember, in Henriette DeLille's day, this mattered, because it meant the difference between living life as a free woman or living life as a slave woman. Henriette's female ancestors were slaves, whereas she and her mother were free. So this stuff mattered then. Anyway, okay, so the original members of Henriette DeLille's Sisters of the Presentation consisted of herself, 7 other young Creole women like her, and a young French woman. They cared for the sick, they helped the poor, they taught, and they took into their home some elderly women who needed more, essentially who needed assisted living, as we would say today. And thereby, they opened America's first Catholic home for the elderly. The bishop, the Most Reverend Antoine Blanc, that's B-L-A-N-C. And for locals, that should not be confused with Bishop Blank, B-L-E-N-K. He's a later bishop, but he was German. He was born in Germany, came to the United States, whereas Bishop Antoine Blanc, B-L-A-N-C, was a French immigrant, a missionary priest, served the archdiocese as bishop beginning in 1835. He was still here in 1850 when New Orleans was elevated from being a diocese to being an archdiocese. So he's also the first archbishop in New Orleans. And then he lived another 10 years until 1860. He knew Henriette. He was very impressed with her and her companions, and he supported them. He applied to Rome for permission to affiliate Henriette DeLille's group with the Sodality of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Rome, which meant that they could participate in indulgenced devotions and thereby, enter more into the Catholic milieu of New Orleans. The request was granted in 1841. The following year, on November 21st, 1842, the group became the Sisters of the Holy Family. The same year, 1842, another French missionary priest, Father Etienne Roussillon, established St. Augustine Parish in New Orleans, which welcomed Creoles of color like Henriette, and this church was where the sisters took their religious vows. Another famous parishioner who influenced American history was a parishioner of the same parish, St. Augustine, was Homer Plessy of the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Anyway, the parish is still functioning, Catholic parish. It's at its original location. In today's enumeration, it's at 1210 Governor Nichols Street. So you can check out the website and see. To give the sisters legal protection, Father Etienne assisted them in incorporating in 1847 so that they could raise money and acquire property as a corporation, which would give them more legal standing. Essentially a juridic person. They would become a juridic person. By the time Henriette Delille died on November 16th, 1862, during the Civil War, the society had 12 sisters. They owned a home for the elderly in the city, the first Catholic nursing home in the country, and later opened St. Mary's Academy for girls. During the yellow fever outbreaks, the sisters took in children whose parents died of the pestilence, leading to the creation of St. John Birchman's orphanage. Meanwhile, the other religious order of women we have already met, the Sisters of Charity, remained active in their medical ministry. Mosquito-inflicted deaths, although at the time they didn't know that cause, recurred annually in New Orleans with depressing regularity from yellow fever and malaria. Since Charity Hospital, by definition, served the poor, and the poor were unlikely to have funds to pay for their own burial, the sisters acquired ground for a charity hospital cemetery in 1848. It still exists. It is situated in what is now referred to as Mid-City, New Orleans. Then Mid-City will no doubt go down in the history of the ages as the birthplace of a priest known for his stunning good looks, his and his hairstyle. It is an inimitable coiffure that he has. Anyway, he was born in Mid-City, New Orleans, within walking distance of this place. In today's enumeration, it is located at 5056 Canal Street. That was at the time well to the north. It was miles north of what was then the city boundaries. It is located between St. Patrick No. 1 Cemetery, which was for Catholics, and Cypress Grove Cemetery, which was for non-Catholics. A historical marker is still there commemorating the victims of yellow fever, and we have an eyewitness account of how those burials took place, so I'll read that shortly. And after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, another historical monument was installed for the victims of the storm who were unidentified and who did not or did not have means to fund their own burials. 5 years after the establishment of this cemetery, bringing us up to 1853, we reach the worst yellow fever outbreak in American history, extinguishing 8,000 lives in New Orleans alone in a single summer. It occurred when the population of the city was 119,000. So that's 8,000 out of 119,000. Once again, as was the case with the 1793 outbreak in Philadelphia, which we covered in the last presentation, we have a priceless asset in an eyewitness account published in 1860 by William L. Robinson. He was a survivor. He was a member of the philanthropic Howard Association. He published it anonymously. It's called the Diary of a Samaritan. It was published by Harper Brothers in 1860, and it's available now. Let's see. It was republished by Harvard University in 2017. Anyway, so you can get it if you want. He records that the dying began in May of 1853. But as Robinson observed, greed and corruption were at hand. His words: the commercial interests of the city insisted strenuously that the state of affairs should not be made public. The real estate speculators were wild with alarm, lest the truth should be told, justifying this appalling malfeasance as leadership to avoid panic, to the point of denouncing as miscreants anyone who tried to publicize the truth. Robinson, along with many others, quickly realized they were being deceived, yet also lacked political and economic power to effect any change, at least at that policy level. So, as in the earlier outbreak in Philadelphia we covered, these people focused on the corporal works of mercy. They divided the city into districts with 10 volunteers for each to visit homes, arrange either transport to the hospital or to pick up medicine or food, for others. So Robinson continued his words, quote, "The stronghold at the commencement in my district was in St. Philip Street, near the levee, where every other house has a beer saloon on the first floor with lodging rooms above. The dormitories and outhouses were a fruitful source of disease. In rooms 18 feet square, there were at least 12 cots, so close together that one man could not pass another. In some, the bedding was dirty, the mosquito netting filthy, the floors spotted with offensiveness, and an atmosphere correspondingly tainted. In most of them, I found the ailing and the sick. Our association had made arrangements with the Sisters of Charity to receive the sick of this district. On the first day, I sent off 3, and every day thereafter as many, and then more. The fever had no sooner completed its work here than it passed from square to square below, gradually diverging from this point toward Rampart and Esplanade Streets." Okay, for those not familiar with New Orleans topography, when Robinson referred to below the city, he actually meant north of the city, which on a map looks like it would be above the city. But in New Orleans, many things that appear to be obvious are not, or otherwise. New Orleans, as we said, is nestled with the river, and then New Orleans is right on the river. And then if you go 5 miles to north of that is Lake Pontchartrain. So the river is the high ground of the city, because it was at a point where the water actually deposited sediment for 6,000 years, so that's higher. But then if you leave the city, and it would be more noticeable then when they're on wagons, as it is now with all the paved streets. When you leave and go north, then you're actually going down. So because the ground is lower, when you go from the river to the lake, the ground is lower at the lake, so you actually are going down. So in that sense, when he says below, that's how locals refer. We say upriver, downriver, and that's just how we do things. And so when he was saying below, then that's what he meant, that they were actually going down toward the lake, so north. All right, otherwise, this was Robinson's first close involvement with the Sisters of Charity. And from this involvement, he developed a profound respect for them, recording for posterity the following, quote, "Chief above all, though, do I record the praise of the Sisters of Charity. I have been long a witness to their modest yet active charity." Now remember, he's writing this out. He's writing this in 1860, so 7 years after these events he's describing. "I have seen the fruits of their watchings and wondered at the charm which sprung from their ministering. In no place can they reap such harvest of good as New Orleans, the consciousness of doing which is their reward during their devoted pilgrimage on earth. They do good by stealth. The light of publicity is no stimulant to them, for virtue, like theirs, rather shuns the more observed it is. They triumph over the flesh, live outside the body, as we do in dreams. Charity is the mainstay of religion. Without a prominent exercise of it, all faith is emptiness. It is also the foundation of justice, epitomized in the words, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Their hearts are mediums through which angels visit humanity, and humanity pleads to God. On July 2nd, 25 died. 2 weeks later, on July 16th, 204 died. Robinson updated his readers on the civic leadership of the time, as contrasted with the heroism of the sisters. Back to his words, quote, "It was then felt that concealment was no longer possible, and the newspapers became again chronicles of the time. The jaunty air with which a serious condition had been treated now gave place to panic-stricken fear. Yet the city government failed completely to grasp the situation. The city council resolved in the last week of July that the yellow fever in the city had not become epidemic. And then they adjourned till October. The cowardly went north, the brave remained, and as citizens did duty which their associates would not let them do officially." In this period, after the evacuation by city leaders, Robinson met a Catholic priest, whom he identified in his diary only as Father L, with the letter L. That was at the priest's request that he be kept anonymous. This Father L humorously described himself as chaplain of the Can't Get Away Club. We can deduce from the text that whoever this was, he was fluent in English, French, and Italian. Robinson did not mention which parish he served. Otherwise, we could figure it out. Anyway, but this priest contracted yellow fever himself while giving extreme unction to the dying. But after 10 days of care from the nuns at Charity Hospital, he was pronounced convalescent, whereupon he consumed chicken broth from the nuns and then went right back to visiting the sick. Robinson later related that a group of Italians came to St. Philip House, which was where he was working, in their time of need. Since these visitors were Catholic, Robinson sent for Father L. So we pick up back. This is a quote from Robinson. "The day following, they, meaning the two Italian guys, they were restless, with the full complexion of a wasting fever." That means they had turned yellow, turned jaundice. "At night, I was present when Father L was in long converse with them, and we received from them an expression of gratitude for all that had been done to them, in a world, they said, in which they never had occasion to offer it before to any man." Thus died two men, who, I inferred from their conversations, were educated to the monotonous civility of a soldier's life, where all sense of what is noble in immortality had been deadened within them until their last moments. Their mere duty as puppets absorbed all higher considerations. They did not perish, however, without one draught of religious hope, repentance, and reliance on the mercy of God, which makes the poor man's exit the rich man's envy. Another repetition of the Philadelphia outbreak consisted of turning to the local African American community for help with nursing, carrying patients, and burying the dead. In this context, the Howard Association acquired use of a second facility, the Globe Ballroom. It was new. It had opened just 2 years earlier. It was a 3-story brick building at the intersection of, this is just going to cloud the issue. well, St. Claude, basically St. Claude and St. Peter. I'll just leave it at that. But it was overlooking. From there, you could see. He says, Robinson says, from there, you could see Congo Square. So, which is on the other side of Rampart, on the north side of Rampart. So Congo Square in 1893 was renamed Beauregard Square. And then in 1980, the whole area, just that Congo Square as well as the area around, was renamed Armstrong Park. And that's what it is today, Armstrong Park. So that, anyway, it's on that area over, looking, facing north. This hosted, the Globe Ballroom was well known. I mean, it's gone, but it was not known in our history. It's hosted an eclectic array of musical performances, including opera and classical, along with dance hall music. This led to the same building becoming one of the cradles of jazz music. Anyway, the Howard Society, making use of donations from other parts of the country, rented the Globe to house overflow from Charity Hospital. There, Robinson called Father L, once again, this time for a French couple, Charles and Philomene. He didn't record their last names. They were in need of the consolation of religion because when they contracted yellow fever. Now, it turned out that these were locals, so Father L knew them. Robinson explained the priest's conduct so soon after he himself had just recovered from near death from yellow fever. So Robinson's words, quote, "And, noble soul, how did he thus brave such fatality? He had not fairly stepped from the influence of the danger himself. Then, upon learning of a friend's prostration, he devoted himself to the enervating cares of the night watcher at the bedside. This unadvised and imprudent step, before 24-hour service, canonized him a martyr to friendship." And yet, despite such inspiring moments, the catastrophe continued. Back to Robinson's words, quote, "By the 10th of August, the mortality had reached an appalling height. The whole city was a hospital. Every well man, woman, and child were instrumental in one way or another in relieving the sick. The streets were deserted, save to the hasty pedestrian on an errand of mercy, the rattling of an omnibus, and the swing of a doctor's gig, as either rapidly passed or on, were the only disturbing sounds. Such was death's harvesting that to keep pace with the call for interments, trenches," now this is back to the Charity Hospital Cemetery I mentioned earlier, to keep pace with the call for interments, that's burials, trenches of 7 feet wide and 100 feet long were being continually dug, into which the coffins were closely packed, 3 to 4 deep, without intermediate earth. When one trench had received its complement and a few feet of earth laid over, a parallel one was made in close proximity. In the absence of labor to dig single graves, friends supplied themselves with spades for that purpose." So this was the Charity Hospital Cemetery for the destitute, or those who died without any family left to care for them, or who just died without identification. As for the Catholic practice of the time, we have his record of the use of Our Lady of Guadalupe Mortuary Chapel on Rampart Street, which locals know as St. Jude Shrine. We talked about it earlier. And that's next to St. Louis number 1 and near St. Louis number 2. So Robinson describes it as follows. "The examples were numerous of priestly martyrdom to their excess of zeal. So much were they in request that it was impossible to meet every demand on their time. Some of the dead were buried without a priestly service. Others were interred with the funeral prayers read by a layman. It was no infrequent occurrence for a minister or priest to be called upon every hour of the day and night to smooth the last hours of the dying, or by kind sympathy to reconcile the survivors to their bereavement. The service on the part of the Catholics was commonly performed in their chapels. The one contiguous to the graveyard on Rampart Street, that's Our Lady Guadalupe Chapel, was a thronged receptacle of the dead and their mourners during the day until dark. Thence arose the mournful Miserere, filling the air with its melancholy influence and heightening still more the universal despondency and sadness. In the district I attended, the poor sick consisted chiefly of the immigrant class, who were generally of the Catholic persuasion. At this period, that would be the Irish and Italians. Well, at this in 1850, this probably is more Irish at this period. The Italians more came later after the Civil War. Continuing the quote, the priest, next to his God, is the Catholic's staff in adversity and trouble. His wants and weaknesses are laid bare to his confessor. It is the province of the latter to comfort, encourage, and advise, which increases until the last rites of religion are administered. The democracy of the Catholic Church secures the humblest member from feeling insignificant. This fact is patent to every observer. I am not a Catholic, nor yet a complaining Protestant. Yet I cannot refrain from demonstrating a feature in one religion which possesses such binding force between its members and their priest. The carnage continued through August. On August 21st, 230 deaths from yellow fever were reported, but more unreported are possible for reasons we've already discussed. The Howard Association then found it necessary to obtain an additional facility, which brings us to another strata of New Orleans society, the white Creoles. In 1794, the latter group established the Polar Star Lodge. In current enumeration, it's located at 1433 North Rampart. Its members included Louisiana's first American governor, Governor Claiborne. The structure in our story was not the original building. It was a two-story Greek Revival building constructed in 1840. So it was 13 years old at this point. Robinson wrote that the Howard Association rented it as a convalescent infirmary. Following yet another example, we see the Philadelphia of the last video, so we're just repeating all that history. So they're following the example of Etienne Girard in Philadelphia, who you may recall, separated those improving from those who were sick. Men were on the first floor of this place, women on the second. One day, 11 orphans were dropped off at this place. So back to Robinson explained their fate in the following words. After several days, many of the children showed symptoms of the sickness. It was proposed that they should all be baptized. As nearly all of the destitute poor in our midst are of foreign birth and Catholic, it was not amiss to baptize them in the rites of that church. An entertainment of cakes and innocent confections for the oldest was therefore obtained. They were clothed in their best, and the ceremony was performed by Father L. They were named after several of the donors to our fund, each of the children having the surname Howard. The hour thus passed that morning, and the scenes that transpired are treasured as saintly relics by all of us who attended. The Board of Health of the city officially declared the city free of epidemic on October 13th, 1853. 8,000 had died between May and October 13th. That's 5 months in one city. Robinson concluded, quote, the epidemic of 1853 had outrun its predecessors in duration. 60 days was its allotted course. Meaning the 1853 one, had not spent all its force until after 90 days. With regard to his organization, he wrote the following. 3,414 cases of yellow fever had been treated, with a result, considering the malignant type of the fever, very gratifying, the deaths averaging about 22%. For most, it's 50%. So they, given all the givens that, given that there's no happy ending to an epidemic, but 22% fatality is better than 50% fatality. Continuing the quote, those cases, it must be recollected, were among the destitute alone, those who were outside the public or private charity. So with that, we come to the end of the second installment of this presentation. The third part will be a separate video that will take us to the yellow fever of 1867, which claimed the life of Blessed Francis Xavier Seeloss, German immigrant, Redemptorist priest, who served in the city and died of the yellow fever. When I haven't done it yet, but when it's completed, it'll be uploaded onto the channel. It'll be on the updates playlist as well as the church history playlist. So before concluding with a prayer, if you are able to assist us at St. Louis King of France financially at this time, you can do so online by clicking the Support St. Louis link below this video. Or if you prefer to use the postal service, the mail-in address is also below this video. Thank you to all of those who have been supporting us, especially during the COVID enclosure. And for those of you who were not able to assist financially at this time, please do continue to assist us spiritually with your prayers. And so we conclude. Almighty God, we ask that you grant us the wisdom to discern what is right, the will to choose it, and the strength to make it endure. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady of Prompt Succor, hasten to help us. St. Louis King of France, pray for us. In conclusion, stay cautious, stay calm, stay safe. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.